Welcome back. Hello friend, about 85% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I had been in the army for 5 years, mostly doing routine patrols and low-risk missions. When I got assigned to a search operation in the mountains of Montana, it seemed like just another day on the job. The mission was to find a criminal who had been on the run for months. His trail led to an old cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The landscape was rough, but the plan was simple. Find him, arrest him, and take him in. We moved slowly, knowing he might be armed and dangerous. The thick trees and heavy bushes made it hard to see far ahead, but I stayed focused. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. As we got closer to the spot marked on our maps, a strange feeling started to creep in. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like I was hyper-aware of everything, like the woods were alive and watching us. The cabin appeared as we reached the top of a small hill. It was old, barely standing, but there were signs that someone had been staying there. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, and fresh tire tracks were in the dirt. My stomach turned as I looked around. Something felt off. We moved in, rifles ready, as we approached from different angles. I stayed low and made my way around the side to get a look through one of the windows. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture thrown everywhere, broken glass on the floor, but there was no sign of the man we were after. My heart started racing as I realized he might not be alone out here. I kept looking around, moving carefully toward the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. A row of shallow graves behind the cabin, each one marked with a simple wooden cross. There were at least a dozen of them, lined up in a messy row. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. None of this had been in the reports. Who were these people? And why were there so many graves? My radio crackled, but I ignored it, focused on the graves. I inched closer. As I got near the first one, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of clothes, children's clothes, torn and dirty. This wasn't just the hideout of a wanted man. Something far worse had happened here. I took a step back, trying to understand what I was looking at. That's when I heard the cabin door creak open behind me. I spun around just in time to see someone run into the trees. Without thinking, I took off after them, my breath coming fast as I crashed through the bushes and branches. Whoever it was knew the woods better than me, slipping between the trees like they had done it hundreds of times. The chase felt like it went on forever. My legs burned, and my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. I had this feeling deep down that if I lost them, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, the person disappeared over a ridge. I slowed down, moving carefully. When I reached the top, I saw what looked like an old bunker, hidden under the ground, almost invisible with the way it blended into the surroundings. The door was slightly open, and that uneasy feeling crept back over me as I got closer. I peeked inside, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The bunker was full of supplies, food, water, guns. But that wasn't the worst part. On the far wall, there were pictures, dozens of them, all of missing people, some of whom I remembered seeing on the news. And in the middle of the room, there was a big map on the wall, covered in red marks. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but then it hit me. These were grave sites. Dozens of them, way more than what was behind the cabin. This guy had been doing this for years, and no one knew. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, raising my weapon, but it was too late. The man we had been hunting stood there, watching me, a sick grin on his face. He had been leading us the whole time, making sure we fell right into his trap. The last thing I saw was the flash of his knife as it came toward me, everything going black. When they found me hours later, I was barely alive. The man was gone, vanished into the woods like he had never been there. But the graves, they were still there. We found more, scattered throughout the forest, each one a reminder of what he had done. They never caught him, and every so often, more people go missing in those woods, their bodies never found. Maybe he's still out there, waiting, watching, ready for the next group to come searching. I'd never been to the cabin before. It was way out in the woods, far from any main roads. My stepmom thought it'd be a good way for us to get closer or whatever. I didn't care much for the idea. She'd been in my life for a few years now, and while she wasn't the worst, I didn't really like her. But this trip wasn't optional. So here I was, sitting in the back seat of the car, staring out at the thick trees swallowing the sky as we drove deeper into the woods. The cabin was small. No neighbors, no cell service, no nothing. Just trees all around and a heavy quiet that made me feel alone the second we stepped out of the car. My stepmom was excited though, saying it was a nice break from the city. I didn't feel the same. Something about being out here made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't say why. That first night wasn't terrible, just quiet. Way too quiet. I laid in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to every little creak in the cabin and the wind outside. I could hear every single noise. Took me a long time to finally fall asleep. The next day, we went on a hike. I wasn't really into it, but my stepmom was set on exploring. I stayed close to her, not because I wanted to, but because something about the woods didn't feel right. It was like we were being watched, even though we were completely alone. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to close in around us, making it darker, and the path was hard to follow. I wanted to turn back, but I kept going, hoping the weird feeling would go away. Didn't. At some point, my stepmom slipped on some loose rocks and twisted her ankle. She tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but I could tell it hurt a lot more than she let on. I offered to go back and get help, but she said we could make it back together. So we started heading back slowly. As we walked, things started to feel different. The trail didn't look right. Stuff I swore I saw on the way in was suddenly missing. The trees looked different, like the whole forest had shifted. The feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. My stomach tightened. We kept walking, but the cabin wasn't showing up. It didn't make sense. We hadn't gone that far, and we were following the trail just as we had come. But something was wrong. Every step seemed to take us deeper into the woods, not closer to the cabin. My stepmom was limping more now, leaning on me to keep moving. The sun was starting to go down, and I could feel panic building in my chest. We had been walking for hours, but we weren't any closer to getting back. The shadows around us were growing longer, and the trees seemed like they were closing in. There was no sound, no animals, no birds, just the crunch of our footsteps and the sound of our breathing. I realized then that we weren't going to make it back before dark. My stepmom's ankle was really bad, and she could barely walk. We needed to stop, maybe start a fire or something to wait it out. But there was no phone signal, no way to call anyone for help, and I didn't know how far we were from anyone else. We found a tree to rest by as the last bit of light faded. My stepmom tried to act calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something was wrong too. It wasn't just her ankle. Then I heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it didn't move like one. It was slow, like something was sneaking up on us, moving carefully just outside where we could see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over, but there was nothing there. The noise stopped, and everything went quiet again. Dead quiet. We didn't talk, didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. For a long time, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw something. Far off, between the trees, there was movement. It was quick, almost too fast to catch. But I saw it. Someone or something was out there, watching us. My stepmom tried to get up, wincing from the pain, but I didn't know what to do. The cabin was somewhere out there, but the woods didn't make sense anymore. We were lost and something was out there with us. We didn't wait around to see what it was. We started walking again, faster this time, even though her ankle was clearly hurting more. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever was out there was following us. We didn't talk, didn't stop, just kept moving. By the time it was completely dark, we finally stumbled on the cabin. It didn't make sense. It wasn't where it should have been. The forest had twisted around us, or maybe we had. But there it was, sitting in the dark like it had been waiting for us. We rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. But even in the cabin, the feeling didn't go away. It was still out there, whatever it was, just beyond the trees, lurking, watching, waiting. That night, we didn't sleep. We didn't talk. We just sat there, wide awake, listening. I kept thinking about how we got lost, how the cabin wasn't where it should have been. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to find our way back. Maybe we never really left the woods. Maybe it's still out there, waiting for us to step outside again. I was driving through the mountains in Australia, and the weather had been all over the place that day. It was sunny in the morning, but as the afternoon came, dark clouds started to roll in. Then the rain hit. It wasn't just a little rain. It was pouring down so hard that I couldn't keep driving safely. I needed to find somewhere to wait it out. That's when I saw a small, old cabin by the side of the road. It looked rough, like no one had lived there in years, but I didn't have any other option. I pulled the car over and parked in front of it. The rain was coming down hard, and by the time I got to the door, I was completely soaked. Luckily, the door wasn't locked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like it had been closed up for a long time, and everything felt damp. The windows were foggy from the rain, and the wind outside was making the walls groan. But at least it was dry, which was all that mattered at the moment. I didn't have much with me, just a small bag with a flashlight, a bit of food, and some water. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I wasn't too stressed about it, though. I figured the rain would calm down soon, and then I'd be back on my way. The cabin was cold, and the rain hitting the roof sounded like it was trying to break through. Night came, and the rain didn't stop. It only got worse. The wind outside was crazy, shaking the whole cabin. I could hear branches breaking in the distance. I held my flashlight close, feeling a bit on edge, but I kept telling myself it was just the storm. Nothing more. I could deal with it. Then I heard something else. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was a different sound altogether. It sounded like footsteps, like someone walking outside through the wet grass. My heart started racing. I sat completely still, listening, hoping that maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, like someone was carefully walking around the cabin. I could feel my pulse quicken. There shouldn't be anyone out here. It was the middle of nowhere, and the storm was way too rough for someone to be outside wandering. I switched off my flashlight and crouched down low, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and steady, and then they stopped. I held my breath, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like forever, I heard a noise at the door. It was faint, but I could hear the doorknob turning, like someone was trying to open it. I froze, staring at the door, praying it wouldn't open. The sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. I thought maybe whoever it was had gone, but then I heard something worse, the sound of a window sliding open. Panic hit me, I realized too late that one of the windows on the other side of the cabin wasn't locked. My flashlight was still off, and I could hear someone or something moving inside the cabin now. The rain was coming down hard outside, making it difficult to hear clearly, but I knew someone was in there with me. I moved back slowly, trying not to make any noise, but I bumped into a chair. It scraped against the floor, and I heard quick, sharp footsteps heading toward me. They knew I was there. Without thinking, I bolted for the door. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get out. I threw open the door and ran into the pouring rain. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I left my stuff behind. I just wanted to get away from that cabin as fast as possible. I made it to my car, shaking and fumbling with the keys. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was soaked, my clothes sticking to my skin, but none of that mattered. I put the car in gear and sped off down the road, not even wiping the fog off the windows. As I drove, I glanced back at the cabin through the rearview mirror. The door was wide open, swinging back and forth in the wind. I didn't see anyone, but I knew they were still there. Someone had been inside with me. Someone had been walking around in that cabin, and they had been watching me the entire time. The rain kept coming down hard, but I didn't care anymore. I wasn't going to stop until I was far away from that place. Whoever or whatever was in that cabin, I knew I'd never forget the sound of those footsteps, or how they felt like they were following me, even now miles down the road. And the worst part, as I kept driving, I realized that the footprints I heard weren't wet when they walked inside. It had been years since I last went to the old family cabin. My grandparents had lived there for as long as I could remember, deep in the woods, far from the noise of town. They loved it out there, and I used to visit them every summer when I was younger. But after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother didn't stay long. She moved closer to us into a small house in town and left the cabin empty. No one really went up there anymore. I always meant to go check on the place, but life got busy. Then, one weekend, I finally decided to make the trip. I drove up the same bumpy dirt road, twisting through the trees, my car shaking like it always did on that uneven path. The cabin looked just like it had before, sitting quietly in the middle of the forest. When I went inside, everything seemed fine at first. There was a layer of dust on the furniture, and the air smelled stale, but it wasn't surprising after all this time. The silence in the cabin was so deep, it made my ears ring. I spent the day cleaning up a bit, wiping off the counters, sweeping the floors. It felt peaceful, but there was something about being alone there that made me uneasy. By evening, the sun was going down, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than usual. The cabin, which had once felt cozy and warm, now seemed too quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just because I wasn't used to being out here anymore. I went to bed early, thinking I'd sleep soundly after a long day of work, but I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling strange. The cabin was completely silent. No creaks, no wind outside, nothing. But it felt wrong. Felt like I wasn't alone. Lying there in the dark, my mind went back to the last time I'd visited my grandparents. That summer had felt different. My grandmother had been quieter than usual. She hardly said a word, which wasn't like her. My grandfather had been tense too. I was too young at the time to understand why, but thinking back, I realized they had been on edge that summer. They never talked about it, but I remembered the heavy feeling in the cabin, the same one I was feeling now. I tried to push those thoughts away and go back to sleep, but I couldn't relax. Then I heard a noise. It was a dull thud, just once, but it echoed in the silence. My heart started racing, but I stayed still, waiting to hear it again. There it was, another thud. This time, it sounded closer, like it came from the front of the cabin. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it wasn't the wind or some animal outside. It felt intentional. I got out of bed, moving quietly so I wouldn't make any noise. I didn't turn on any lights, just crept through the darkness, my eyes adjusting. The old wooden floor creaked under my feet as I walked toward the living room. I waited there, standing still in the dark, but the noise didn't come again. For some reason, I felt the urge to open the front door, like I needed to know what was out there. I opened it slowly, expecting to see something, but the porch was empty. The trees were still, the wind barely moving through them. Then I noticed something. Footprints in the dirt, just at the bottom of the steps. They weren't there when I had arrived earlier, and they were fresh, still sharp in the dirt. They led away from the cabin, into the trees. I stared at those footprints for what felt like forever, my mind spinning. Someone had been here, standing right at the edge of the porch. They hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, just stood there in the dark, watching. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart pounded as I stood in the middle of the cabin, trying to figure out what was happening. The air inside felt heavy again, like whoever had been outside had never really left. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any noise, any sign that they were still out there. But the quiet never broke again. It stayed silent, almost too silent, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. When the first light of morning finally came through the windows, I grabbed my stuff and left. I didn't bother cleaning up or looking back. I just got in my car and started driving. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched all night, not just from outside, but from inside the cabin too. Something had been off in that place, something I hadn't noticed when I was younger. It hit me then why my grandmother had left so suddenly after my grandfather passed. It wasn't just grief or wanting to be closer to family. She knew something wasn't right about that cabin. I had felt it too, in the way the air seemed thick, in the way the silence felt wrong. Something had been out there that night, and maybe it had always been there. As I drove further away, I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing on the porch. But when I looked again, it was gone. I don't know what it was or who it was, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to that cabin again. Something isn't right in those woods, and whatever it is, I don't want to find out. I've been living in this cabin for over 30 years now. It's deep in the mountains, far away from anyone. Just how I like it. As I've gotten older, I've come to enjoy the quiet even more. No one is nearby for miles, and that's always made me feel safe. But lately, things have started to feel off. A few weeks back, I noticed small things were out of place. My tools weren't where I'd left them. The back door, which I always make sure to lock, was cracked open. At first, I thought it was just me getting older and maybe I was starting to forget stuff. But then more things started happening. I'd wake up to find the pile of firewood scattered or food missing from the pantry. I'm not someone who gets scared easily, so I figured it had to be an animal. Bears come through the area sometimes, and they can get pretty close to the cabin. But this didn't feel like something a bear would do. No scratches, no tracks, just small things out of place. It felt like someone had been in my cabin when I wasn't paying attention. One night, I decided to stay up late to try and figure out what was going on. I sat by the window, looking out into the dark. The woods around the cabin seemed to swallow up all the light. It was so quiet. I sat there for hours and saw nothing. I was about to head to bed when I heard a sound behind me. It was soft, just the creak of the floor, like someone was stepping on it. I turned around slowly, staring into the dim cabin light. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart started racing, pounding in my ears. I got up and walked through every room, checking everything. Nothing. No one was there. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, but I knew I was starting to feel uneasy. For the next few days, nothing happened. Things seemed to go back to normal, and I thought maybe I was overthinking things. Then one evening, I went outside to chop some wood before it got too dark. I was out there splitting logs when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Movement. Something shifting between the trees, just beyond the tree line. I stopped, axe in hand, and looked toward the woods. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. A shape moving through the shadows. It was almost like it was trying to stay hidden. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew it wasn't an animal. Whoever or whatever it was watching me. A cold chill ran down my back. My cabin is miles away from the nearest road. No one should have been out here. I dropped the axe and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little sound, every creak of the floor, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just watching me from the trees. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. That's when I saw the footprints. They led right up to my door. They weren't mine. That's when I knew it was time to leave. I packed up what I could, threw it into my truck, and planned to head to town. Maybe I'd stay with my brother for a bit until I figured out what to do next. As I was loading up the last of my things, I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Slow, careful. I didn't even turn around. I could feel someone standing there, watching me. I jumped into my truck, started it, and sped off down the dirt road, not looking back once. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I left everything behind, but I don't care. I still think about that place, though, wondering if someone's living there now, or if they were always there waiting for me to leave. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. My brother-in-law, Tom, and his friend, Jake, invited me to their cabin deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a fun break from the city, a chance to relax and enjoy nature. But as soon as we got there, I felt something was off. The cabin was old and creaky, surrounded by tall trees that looked like they were hiding secrets. After we unpacked, we decided to go for a hike. The trail was narrow and tangled, twisting through the trees like a snake. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone behind us, but all I saw was the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. When we returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The shadows stretched longer, and the air felt heavy. Tom suggested we build a fire outside. While we gathered wood, I noticed something strange at the edge of the clearing. A figure stood still among the trees, almost blending into the shadows. I blinked, and it disappeared. I told myself I was imagining it, trying to push the thought away. Later, as we sat around the fire, the warmth felt good, but I couldn't relax. I kept thinking I saw movement in the dark, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The fire crackled, and I kept glancing at the tree line, convinced I'd seen that figure again. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear an owl hooting somewhere in the distance. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a rustling outside. My heart raced as I listened closely. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and steady, coming closer. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked over at Tom and Jake, who were still fast asleep. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly moved to the window. I shone the light outside, scanning the darkness. My breath caught when the beam landed on the figure I'd seen before. It stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dark. I couldn't see its face, but a chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, panic rising in me. Should I wake them? I didn't want to sound crazy, but I also didn't want to be alone with whatever was out there. Just then, the figure moved, stepping into the light. I could see it more clearly now. It was a man, wearing ragged clothes, his face hidden by shadows. He didn't seem to notice the light. He just stood there staring into the cabin. I turned, my heart racing, and rushed to wake Tom. I whispered urgently, but he groaned and rolled over. I felt desperate to protect myself. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The wind picked up outside, and the trees rustled loudly. The man outside hadn't moved. He just continued to watch. Then I heard a loud thud against the cabin. I froze. My mind raced. Was it just a branch, or was someone trying to break in? I felt panic rising in my throat. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table and crept to the door, preparing for the worst. I opened the door a crack, and cold air rushed in. The man was gone. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the dark. The ground was covered with branches, but there was no sign of him. Just as I turned to go back inside, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. He was back, standing just beyond the trees, his eyes reflecting the light. My heart raced, and in a surge of panic, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I yelled for Tom and Jake again, my voice breaking the silence of the night. Finally, they woke up, groggy and confused. I quickly told them what I saw, but they laughed it off. "Just your imagination," Tom said, but I could see Jake's concern. We decided to stay awake, taking turns to keep watch. Every sound in the night sent shivers down my spine. Hours passed, and dawn started to break, light filtering through the trees. I felt completely worn out, but seeing the sunrise gave me some relief. Just as I thought we were safe, I heard a loud crash echo through the cabin. The back door had been forced open. In a panic, we scrambled to grab anything we could find. A chair, a table leg, anything to defend ourselves. I peeked outside again, and this time I saw the man standing in the doorway, staring at us with an unsettling calmness. Tom's face went pale. He stepped forward, trying to reason with the man, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a step inside, and that's when I noticed something shiny in his hand. A knife. My heart dropped. Without thinking, I lunged forward and pushed him back. The shock of my action seemed to snap us all back into reality. We rushed to shove him out, and somehow we managed to force him into the daylight, making him hesitate. We slammed the door shut and locked it again, our hearts racing. The man pounded on the door, shouting something we couldn't understand. He quickly realized he was outnumbered. The sound of his footsteps faded as he backed away into the woods. We didn't sleep for the rest of the morning. Instead, we packed up quickly, our hearts still racing. As we drove away from that cabin, I glanced back one last time. The forest seemed to swallow it up, hiding everything that had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. As we drove further away, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I looked at Tom and Jake, trying to shake off the fear that clung to me. But the thought lingered, what if that man wasn't just a stranger? What if he was still watching us, waiting for another chance? The woods had swallowed our secret, but it would always haunt me, knowing that in those shadows, something sinister was lurking, ready to strike again. I knew I wouldn't be returning to that cabin, and every rustle of leaves would remind me of what we barely escaped. I stood in front of an old cabin, deep in the woods. I had hiked for hours, the trail turning into a narrow path covered in leaves and branches. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, making me feel completely alone. The cabin looked very old, with gray, worn wooden walls and dirty, cracked windows. A shiver of fear and curiosity ran through me. As I walked closer to the door, I saw the lock was broken, just hanging there. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. A musty smell hit me, and I squinted in the dim light. Dust floated in the air, lit up by the weak sunlight coming through the dirty windows. I looked around and saw old furniture covered in sheets, as if someone had left in a hurry. The fireplace was cold and empty, its black stones telling stories of fires that had long since gone out. I decided to explore further and found a small bedroom. The bed was still made, but the sheets were yellowed with age. A dresser was pushed against the wall, and on it, I found a faded picture of a family. 2 adults and a little girl, all smiling. But something didn't feel right. An uneasy feeling crept in as I noticed the girl's eyes seemed to follow me, so I quickly looked away. I wanted to leave, but as I turned back toward the front door, I heard a noise behind me, a creak followed by a soft thud. My heart raced as I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I stood still, listening. Then I heard it again, a faint rustling sound coming from the attic above. Despite my better judgment, I climbed the shaky stairs leading up to the attic. The steps creaked under my weight, and dust swirled around me. When I reached the top, I opened the door and looked inside. The attic was dark and filled with old boxes, their contents long forgotten. I took a careful step forward and spotted it. A small, tattered toy doll lying on the floor, its face cracked and dirty. As I bent down to pick it up, I noticed a movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just shadows and memories of the past. Shaking, I grabbed the doll and prepared to leave. Suddenly, a chilling cold swept over me, as if the air had changed. I knew I needed to get out. I rushed down the stairs, almost tripping on the last step. I flung open the front door and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air. But then I froze. That feeling of being watched washed over me again, stronger than before. I glanced back at the cabin, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window, just beyond the dirt. Without wasting another second, I sprinted down the path I had come from. My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't stop until I reached my car parked by the road. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin disappeared into the trees, but that feeling of dread clung to me, reminding me that some places should be left alone. The woods swallowed the cabin, hiding it once again, but I couldn't shake the sense that I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found. The more I drove, the more uneasy I felt, as if something was following me, lurking just out of sight. When I reached the edge of the town, I looked back one last time. The cabin loomed in my mind, and I swore I saw the outline of the little girl from the photograph standing at the window, staring at me with her cracked, soulless eyes. I couldn't help but think that maybe she had never really left. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, buried deep in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never truly escape the woods, or whatever dark thing was hiding there, waiting for someone to return. I had been hiking deep in the woods all morning when I found an old farm cabin. It was hidden away, half covered by thick trees and tall grass. The place looked like nobody had been there for years. The wood was worn out, and one side of the roof had caved in. I'd never seen this cabin on any map, even though I had spent a lot of time planning this trip. But I was curious, so I decided to get closer. As I got nearer, I saw just how old it really was. Rusted tools were scattered around the yard, and the windows were boarded up. Some of the boards had fallen off. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, and the place smelled like wet wood and rot. The cabin wasn't big. It had just one room. There was a broken table leaning against the wall, and shelves full of old jars. I didn't even want to think about what might be inside them. I walked around carefully, not touching anything. The floor creaked with every step, and I noticed that some of the wood had holes in it. As I explored the back of the cabin, I saw a door that looked like it led to a cellar. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I should open it. Something about going down into that dark cellar made me uneasy, but I couldn't stop myself. The door groaned as I pulled it open, and I saw steep wooden stairs going down. They looked like they could fall apart any second. The space below was pitch black. I took out my flashlight and pointed it down. The light cut through the darkness, showing a dirt floor at the bottom. It looked like nobody had been down there in a long time. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I started going down. The air got colder with every step. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the walls were lined with more shelves, just like the ones upstairs. But these shelves were also filled with jars, and I could see strange things inside them. I didn't want to get closer to find out what they were. There was also an old, rusty furnace against the wall, and the smell down here was even worse. It made my stomach turn. I was ready to leave, but then I noticed something strange. There was a patch of dirt in the corner that looked different from the rest of the floor. The ground had been messed with recently, like someone had dug there. I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. Who would have been out here? Just then, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, like something scraping against the floor above. My heart started pounding. I quickly turned off my flashlight and stood still, listening. The scraping stopped. The cabin was silent, but I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone. Trying to stay calm, I backed away from the strange patch of dirt and moved toward the stairs. I heard the sound again, closer this time, like something was moving slowly upstairs. I took each step as quietly as I could, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight stayed off. I didn't want to let whoever or whatever was up there know I was coming. When I reached the top, I slowly closed the cellar door behind me and paused to listen. The noise had stopped. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever. Then, I heard a rustle outside the cabin. I stepped out, my hands shaking, and closed the door behind me. It creaked loudly in the quiet forest. I didn't move for a moment, waiting to see if I heard anything else. But the woods were silent. I started walking quickly, not bothering to look back. Something inside me told me to leave and not question what I had just experienced. I hurried through the trees, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that nobody had been there. But deep down, I knew something was off. That patch of dirt in the cellar kept popping into my mind. Someone had been there recently, and whatever they did, they didn't want anyone to find out. As I reached my camp, the sun was already going down. I packed my stuff in a rush, desperate to get out of the forest before it got dark. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. The shadows in the trees seemed darker, and I felt like something was following me, staying just out of sight. I never told anyone about the cabin. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. That patch of dirt in the cellar wasn't just disturbed. It was hiding something, and whoever had been there wasn't finished with it. I had been working as a forest ranger in the US for more than 10 years, and most of the time, the days blended into each other. Long hours alone watching over the forest. I was assigned to a small, old cabin deep in a part of the forest where not many people go. The cabin was basic, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat, a bed, and a few things to get by. It had been built years ago by rangers before me. I liked being out there, away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. One evening, after finishing my rounds, I settled into the cabin, ready to call it a night. The sun had just gone down, and the sky was turning dark. I lit an old lantern and sat down at the small wooden table to jot down some notes about the day. The forest was quieter than usual. Normally, you'd hear crickets, the wind moving through the trees, maybe an owl in the distance. But that night, there was nothing, just complete silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some nights were like that, where the animals seemed to disappear. I went back to writing, trying to ignore the strange stillness. After a little while, I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like something moving through the leaves. I stood up and looked out the small window, but there was nothing there. It could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, or maybe just the wind. But then the sound got closer. It wasn't a soft rustling anymore. It was a slow, steady crunch of leaves and branches, like something or someone was walking toward the cabin. I reached for my flashlight on the table, clicked it on, and pointed it out the window. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trees and shadows. No movement, no animals, just the same eerie silence. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was small, and I'd always felt safe there, even in worse conditions out in the wild. But that night, I couldn't relax. The uneasy feeling stuck with me, and I found myself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see something watching me. Then, just when I thought I might be overthinking it, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. It was sharp and sudden, like something heavy had hit the wooden wall. I jumped up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight again. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch. The night was pitch black, except for where my flashlight shone. The trees stood tall and still, their branches barely moving in the slight breeze. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of an animal, no fallen branches. The ground looked untouched. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The silence was back, heavier than before. Even the breeze had stopped. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I scanned the trees one last time before heading back inside and locking the door. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just being out here too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had spent too many nights alone in the woods. I went to bed, but sleep was hard to come by. I stayed alert, listening for any sound, waiting for that noise to come back. Hours passed, and at some point, I must have drifted off. But when I woke up, it was still dark, and something was wrong. I sat up and realized the cabin door was open. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew for sure I had locked it. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight from the table. I clicked it on and aimed it at the door. It was wide open, slowly creaking on its hinges. My mind raced, trying to figure out what had happened. Was it the wind? But there hadn't been any wind strong enough to do that. Was it an animal? But animals don't open doors. I froze, standing there in the middle of the cabin, unsure of what to do next. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the dirt just outside the door. They were human. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Someone had been out there. They had been close enough to open the door without me hearing them. I hadn't heard a thing. I stood there, flashlight in hand, paralyzed by the thought of what had happened. Whoever it was, they were still out there. Maybe they were watching me right now from the woods, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to step outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat at the table, flashlight ready, listening to every creak and crack. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I didn't stop walking until I made it to the ranger station, miles away. I filed a report, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find anything. The forest was too big, too isolated. Whoever it was, they knew the area better than I did. They knew how to move quietly, how to stay hidden. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I still wonder who or what was out there that night. I wonder if they're still in those woods, watching, waiting for the next ranger to come by. Whoever they were, they weren't looking for a conversation. They were waiting for something, and whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I'd never been part of anything like this before. The air around the cabin was cold and still, making everything feel tense. I was only here to clear out an old family cabin deep in the woods, a job I got stuck with after my uncle passed away. But when I arrived, something didn't feel right. The cabin hadn't been touched in years, but there were fresh footprints leading up to the front door. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe some hunters or hikers had wandered by. The cabin was in a remote spot, but it wasn't impossible for someone to come across if they were deep in the woods. As I opened the door and stepped inside, a musty smell hit me right away. Stale air mixed with the smell of old wood and dust. But there was something else too, something metallic in the air that I couldn't quite figure out. The cabin had one big room with a fireplace and a couple of small bedrooms on the side. The floor creaked loudly under my boots as I walked through. I was just trying to make a mental list of what needed to be done when I noticed the basement door. It was slightly open, which was odd because I remembered that door always being shut when I visited as a kid. I stood there for a bit, staring at the door, wondering if I should even bother going down. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door wider, and a strong, awful smell rushed out. It was overwhelming, something foul, like something had been rotting for a long time. I almost turned around right then, but something inside me pushed me to keep going. I had to see what was down there. The wooden steps creaked with each step as I made my way down, the air getting colder as I went. There wasn't much light, just enough to see that the basement had been disturbed. The old beams on the ceiling were the same, but the floor wasn't. The dirt had been moved around, uneven, like someone had been digging. My heart pounded as I spotted something sticking out of the dirt. It was a torn piece of fabric, part of a jacket, and it looked too new to have been there for long. That's when the panic hit. I backed up quickly, nearly tripping over the steps as I rushed out of the basement. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I saw. It didn't take long for it to sink in. There were bodies buried down there, and not just one. Someone had been using the cabin for something much worse than I ever imagined. I bolted out of the cabin and called the police right away. The wait felt like forever, even though it was only about 40 minutes. By the time they got there, I had already gone over everything in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it all. The police were quiet and careful as they started searching the area. They asked me a few questions but treated me like a witness. Still, I could feel their eyes on me, like they were wondering if I knew more than I was letting on. When they went down into the basement, I didn't follow. I stayed outside, staring into the trees, listening to the sound of the police moving through the woods, searching for more signs of what had happened here. Time seemed to drag on, and before I knew it, the sun was starting to set. I felt trapped in this nightmare that I couldn't escape. After what felt like hours, one of the officers came back up and gave a nod to the others. From the look on their faces, I knew they'd found more than I had. They didn't tell me much, but I overheard bits and pieces. There were multiple bodies, some that had been there for years and others more recent. Whoever had been using the cabin as their dumping ground had been doing it for a long time, quietly, and without anyone noticing. I don't know if they'll ever catch the person responsible. They asked me if I had seen anyone or if there were any signs of people nearby, but I hadn't. It's like whoever did this had been careful, sneaking in and out of the woods without leaving a trace, except for what was buried beneath the cabin. I haven't gone back to the cabin since that day, and I don't plan to. Every time I think about it, I can still smell that awful scent from the basement, the smell that hit me as soon as I opened that door. The police closed off the cabin, but I know it's still there, filled with its dark secrets. I was just unlucky enough to find them. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I wonder if the person who buried those bodies is still out there, walking through the woods, hiding in the shadows. I wonder if they know I found their hiding spot, and if they're waiting for the right moment to come back. The cabin might be locked up, but that doesn't stop the memories from creeping in, reminding me of what I found and what might still be out there. One day, I'm afraid they'll come looking for me. I went to visit my grandparents at their cabin, way out in the woods. It had always been a peaceful place to me, where everything felt quiet and calm. They'd lived there for years since they stopped working, and I'd spent many summers there when I was a kid. But this time, something was off. The cabin looked the same as always, simple, made of wood, surrounded by tall trees. It was as quiet as I remembered. My grandparents were still the same too, kind and welcoming. But there was something strange in the air, something that made me feel uneasy. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining it, that maybe the silence was just messing with my head. The days moved slow out there. The silence wasn't like what you get in the city. This kind of quiet felt heavy, and at night, it was full of weird sounds. Branches cracking, animals rustling around, and the wind blowing through the trees like a low whistle. My grandparents didn't seem to mind at all. They acted like it was normal, just the way it was living in the woods. But for some reason, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I'd lie awake, feeling restless. One evening, I took a walk around the cabin, hoping it would help me relax. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The ground near the edge of the woods looked like it had been dug up. There were patches of dirt that didn't look natural. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to figure out what might have caused it. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just animals digging around. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The sounds outside seemed louder than before, almost like footsteps crunching through the leaves. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing. I felt on edge, like something was wrong, but I didn't want to worry my grandparents. They seemed perfectly fine, as if nothing unusual was happening. The next morning, I decided to go for another walk. I needed to clear my head. When I walked past that same spot by the trees, I stopped. The patches of dirt had been disturbed again, but this time something caught my eye. I crouched down to get a better look and saw something sticking out of the ground, just barely visible. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the top of a shoe. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. Something was buried there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I stood up quickly, backing away from the spot, my thoughts all over the place. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew this wasn't right. The rest of the day, I watched my grandparents more closely. They went about their day like everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew exactly what was buried out there, just a few feet away from the cabin. They never mentioned it, never acted like anything was strange. They kept smiling, talking, doing what they always did. I didn't stay another night. The next morning, I told them I had to leave, making up some excuse about needing to get back home early. I drove away from the cabin, speeding down the dirt road, my mind still spinning. I haven't gone back since. Now I can't stop thinking about it. I wonder how many times they've done this, how many people have ended up buried in those woods. How long have they been getting away with it? And how many others have visited, only to disappear without a trace? Every time I think of how normal they seemed, how they never let on that anything was wrong, It chills me to my core. The scariest part? I'll never know what would have happened if I stayed another night. I had been excited about this trip for a while. A few days in a cabin deep in the woods, far from all the noise, seemed like the perfect break. It was late September, and the leaves were turning red and orange. The cool air felt fresh. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a small wooden place with a bed, a wood stove, and a few chairs. It had no electricity, no running water. That was part of the plan. No phone service, no internet, just me and nature. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled in the wood stove, keeping me warm, and the quiet of the woods felt calm. I could hear some animals in the distance, but nothing unusual. The next morning, I went for a walk, exploring the trails around the cabin. The deeper I went, the more alone I felt. The trees were thick, and the bushes were dense. After a few hours, I turned back, not wanting to go too far. That evening, something started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, and it suddenly hit me that the usual sounds of the woods had stopped. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. It was unsettling. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the animals had just gone quiet for the night. But something didn't sit right with me. I kept looking out the window, staring into the dark woods, expecting to see something, though I didn't know what. The next morning, I found huge footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were fresh. My stomach dropped. They weren't animal tracks, and they were way bigger than mine. The weird part was, I hadn't heard anyone come by during the night. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just a hunter passing through, but I didn't believe it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the day close to the cabin, staying within sight of it, and kept checking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now. It was as if the trees were watching me. By the time the afternoon came, I was back inside, locking the door. I didn't feel safe anymore. The sun went down fast, and the fire kept burning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, heavy, moving around the cabin. My heart raced, and I stayed frozen in bed. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard a light scraping against the wall, like someone was dragging their hand along the wood. I didn't move. I tried to keep my breathing quiet. Time seemed to stretch on forever before the noises finally stopped. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed my stuff. I wasn't sticking around. When I stepped outside, I froze. The footprints were back, deeper this time, circling the cabin several times. And on the wall, scratched into the wood, was a single line. I couldn't read the whole thing, but I didn't need to. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I hurried to get out of there. The drive back through the forest felt endless, and I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone or something behind me. When I finally got home, I tried to forget about the whole thing, but every now and then, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, I wake up at night and think I hear footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I know someone found me out there in the woods, and I think they're still watching. The sun dipped low over the French countryside as I settled into my old cabin, a simple place hidden in the thick woods. I had left the army years ago, looking for peace and quiet, far from the chaos of my past. This cabin, with its squeaky floors and rough wooden beams, had become my safe haven. As the day turned to night, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth spread slowly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I listened to the crackling wood and breathed in the fresh scent of pine that filled the air. Outside, the forest buzzed with life, crickets chirping and leaves rustling. But there was an uneasy silence creeping in with the night. After finishing my dinner, I decided to take a short walk along the trail behind the cabin. The moonlight shone through the trees, lighting my way. It felt peaceful, but a strange feeling crept over me, like someone was watching. I hadn't felt that way since my time in the service. I shook it off and focused on the familiar sounds of the forest. After a bit, I spotted something odd, a faint light flickering deep in the woods. It was strange. I had walked this trail many times, and I knew there were no houses around. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly moved toward the light. As I got closer, I saw it was a small clearing, and in the center stood an old, rusty truck with dim headlights. I could hardly believe my eyes. Who would be out here at this hour in an old truck? Caution took over, reminding me of my army training. I moved slowly, trying to look inside the truck. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the shadows near the truck. My heart raced as I stepped back, realizing I wasn't alone. Something was hiding just beyond the moonlight, lurking in the trees. My instincts kicked in. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my boots thumping against the ground. Behind me, I heard branches snapping, something heavy following me. I reached the cabin door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the old lock. Once inside, I quickly shoved a heavy table against the door. My breath came in quick gasps as I leaned against the door, straining to listen over the pounding of my heart. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Time dragged on, and each second felt like an hour. Outside, the forest was still, but that feeling of being watched came back, stronger than before. I peered out through the window, expecting to see eyes staring back at me. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting through the trees. It was low to the ground and moved fast. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't human. Whatever had been hunting me was still out there, waiting for its chance. As dawn broke, the light began to brighten the forest. I carefully opened the door, still feeling the weight of the night's terror. The clearing was empty now, but the truck was gone. The only signs of something being there were the broken branches scattered around and a heavy, unsettling quiet that filled the air. I knew then that I would never go back to that clearing. Whatever had been lurking there, whatever had growled in the dark, was still out there, hidden in the trees. A chill ran down my spine as I felt a heavy dread settle over me. I would stay in my cabin but wouldn't step foot into those woods again. This place, which I once thought was a peaceful refuge, reminded me that some battles don't end with a victory. They linger, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I closed the door behind me, I realized the truth. The woods had eyes, and they were watching me. I could feel their gaze like a weight on my shoulders, knowing that my time in this cabin was only a temporary escape from the danger that waited just outside. The forest was alive and it was hungry. I drove up to the cabin, the tall trees standing dark and foreboding against the setting sun. This place held memories of better times, when we were together, enjoying life's simple pleasures. But after the divorce, I hadn't been back. I thought it might help to spend a weekend alone, to think things over and maybe stir up some old feelings. Inside, the air felt stale, filled with the smell of old firewood and forgotten laughter. I dropped my bags and opened the windows, letting in the cool evening breeze. The sounds of nature began to break the silence, the rustling leaves, the chirping crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calm, but there was a strange feeling in the air that I couldn't shake off. That night, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into a chair with a book. As I turned the pages, something flickered in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving just outside the window. I paused, straining to see into the darkness, but nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing games. As the fire crackled, my thoughts drifted back to happier times. I remembered our first trip to this cabin, the laughter we shared, the warmth of our hugs under the stars. But those memories felt far away, like a dream that had faded with the morning. I shook off the thoughts and went back to reading, hoping to push away the creepy feeling creeping up my spine. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a soft thud, like something heavy dropping to the ground. My heart started racing as I set the book aside and listened. The cabin was dark, lit only by the flickering firelight. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold against my skin, and the forest felt alive around me. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, looking for anything strange. Suddenly, I saw a figure just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was a man, tall and broad, standing still as if waiting for me to make a move. A wave of fear hit me, mixed with an odd sense of familiarity. He looked like someone I used to know, a flashback to a summer spent with friends. I wanted to call out, but no words came. The figure took a step closer, and panic surged through me. I turned and ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Inside, I felt both safe and trapped. My heart pounded as I tried to calm myself. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the crackling fire. Then came a loud knock on the door, shaking the wood frame. My heart raced again, and I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly in my hand. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, but I couldn't just stand there. I knew I had to face whatever or whoever was out there. With a deep breath, I opened the door a crack, flashlight aimed at the figure outside. To my shock, it was my ex-wife. She stood there, her eyes wide with fear and regret. Relief washed over me, but confusion quickly followed. She had come looking for me, worried when I didn't reply to her texts. We both felt a rush of emotions, recalling our shared past. She stepped inside, and I closed the door behind her. The warmth of the cabin felt different now, heavy with unspoken tension. As we sat by the fire, sharing bits of our lives since the split, I realized that this weekend was more than just a chance to think. It was an opportunity to reconnect, to see if we could build something new from what we lost. We talked late into the night, laughter and memories filling the space. Outside, the darkness loomed, but inside, an uneasy warmth began to grow. Just then, we heard a noise, a sharp rustle outside, followed by a low, menacing growl. The laughter died on our lips as we exchanged uneasy glances. I grabbed the flashlight again and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing at first. Then, just at the edge of the trees, I caught sight of something. Two glowing eyes stared back at us, unblinking and hungry. My heart dropped as the reality hit me. This wasn't just a feeling. We were not alone. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing in the quiet night. My ex-wife's face went pale as the shadows shifted outside, revealing the shape of a large creature moving closer, blending in and out of the trees. I gripped the poker tighter, knowing that whatever it wasn't friendly. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The fire dimmed, and we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I scrambled to keep calm. The creature was now right outside the cabin, its breathing heavy and labored. We could hear the claws scraping against the wooden walls, searching for a way in. I turned to my ex-wife, but she had gone quiet, fear written all over her face. In that moment, I realized that even in this frightening situation, our shared past felt like a distant memory. The connection we were trying to rebuild felt fragile, like the flickering flame of the fire that could go out at any moment. Just as I felt the weight of despair settle in, the scratching stopped. The cabin was eerily silent, but we knew it wasn't over. The feeling of being hunted hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the darkness thickened, and the eyes disappeared, leaving us with only the sound of our racing hearts. I knew then that this cabin would hold more than just our memories. It would become a place of fear and uncertainty. Perhaps we'd come seeking comfort, but we found only dread, a chilling reminder that the past could come back in the most unexpected ways. The weekend wasn't just a second chance. It was a fight for survival, and we both realized the darkness outside was nothing compared to the shadows we carried within. I had always wanted to visit the French countryside. The thought of spending a few days in a quiet cabin away from everything sounded perfect. So I found a small cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, far from the city noise. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. There was nothing around but trees and the sound of the wind. No cars, no people, just quiet. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, sipping on some wine, and just watched the flames flicker. It was so quiet, almost too quiet. There was something strange about the silence, but I told myself I just wasn't used to it. After living in the city for years, this kind of quiet would take some getting used to. But the second night was different. As soon as it got dark, I started feeling strange. It was like something wasn't right. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching me. I tried reading to calm myself down, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, like someone walking through the leaves. I froze, listening closely, but the sound stopped just as quickly as it started. I hurried to lock the doors and shut all the windows, telling myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk through the woods, hoping it would help me relax. The fresh air helped at first, and I started to feel better. But after walking for a while, I realized I had lost my way. The trees were thick, and everything started to look the same. I tried to find the path back to the cabin, but after about an hour of walking, I knew I was lost. I didn't have a map, and my phone had no signal. Panic started to set in. I picked a direction and walked faster, hoping it would lead me back. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more confused I became. Everything around me looked identical. Endless trees, no landmarks, no signs of the cabin. By the time the sun started to set, I still hadn't found my way back. I knew I'd have to spend the night out there. I found a small, open area and decided to stay there. As it got dark, the woods around me went completely silent again. That same feeling I had the night before returned, only worse this time. I didn't sleep. Every little sound, leaves moving, twigs snapping, made my heart race. At one point, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, careful steps. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped after a while, but I never heard them walk away. It was like whatever was out there had stopped, standing just out of sight, waiting. When the sun came up, I hurried to pack my things and walked as fast as I could. After hours of wandering, I finally saw the cabin through the trees. But something was wrong. The front door was wide open. I know I had locked it before I left. I walked inside carefully. Everything looked the same, but there was something strange about the air inside, like the place wasn't quite right. I checked all the windows. They were still locked from the inside, just as I had left them. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling was still there, that someone had been inside while I was gone, watching. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, left the cabin, and started driving. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me leave. As I drove away, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got stronger, like something was still following me. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling. Every time I step outside, it feels like someone's watching from the shadows, waiting. I never saw anyone, but I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I don't think I ever will be again. It was late evening when we got the call. Someone had tipped us off about some illegal stuff going on at an old cabin deep in the woods. The plan seemed easy. Go in, check for any signs of crime, and arrest anyone inside. It sounded simple enough. I had been doing this job long enough to know that things rarely ever go as smoothly as they sound. Still, I had my team with me and we were all ready for it. We parked a few miles out from the cabin and walked the rest of the way through the woods. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear some birds or at least the wind blowing through the trees. But that night, it felt like the whole place was holding its breath. It didn't scare me, but something about it made me uneasy. It was just that feeling you get when you know something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the cabin was barely visible up ahead, just an old, run-down building with a single light on inside. As we got closer, I could feel the tension in the group. Everyone was on edge. We moved in quietly, checking around the outside of the cabin. The place looked like it had been abandoned for a while, but someone had to be inside. There were fresh tire marks in the mud outside, and that light didn't turn on by itself. I broke off from the others, moving around the back of the cabin. My flashlight cut through the darkness, barely lighting up the area in front of me. Then I smelled it, a strong, sharp smell in the air, metallic and heavy. Blood. I knew it right away. I told the others to wait, not to move in just yet. I got closer to the cabin, crouching down by the back window. When I looked inside, my stomach dropped. There was a man tied to a chair in the middle of the room. His head was hanging forward, and the floor underneath him was covered in blood. I couldn't tell from where I was if he was dead or alive, but it was bad, real bad. This wasn't just some small crime. This was something much worse. My chest tightened with the feeling that we had walked into something we weren't prepared for. I gave the signal and we entered the cabin. Right away, I could tell this wasn't just about drugs or something simple. Whoever had done this had been brutal. The man in the chair didn't move. His skin was pale, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Whoever had done this left recently, but not long enough for the blood to dry. As the others checked the place, something caught my eye. The floorboards under the chair looked uneven, like they had been pulled up and put back down. I knelt beside them and pried one of the boards loose. Underneath, there was a small space, and inside it was a camera, still recording. Whoever had done this had been watching. Maybe they still were. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked around the cabin. This wasn't just some crime scene. It was a setup. We were being watched, like this was all part of a bigger plan. That's when I saw it. A small red dot appeared on the wall, flickering around before landing on my chest for a split second. My heart raced. A sniper's laser. We weren't alone. I signaled the others to stay low, and we quietly slipped out of the cabin. We moved quickly but carefully back to the tree line. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for the worst. They knew we were there. They saw us leave, but no shots were fired. No one chased us. We made it back to the vehicles without a word. The whole time, my mind was racing, trying to figure out why they hadn't taken the shot. Why did they let us walk out of there? Maybe they wanted us to find the body. Maybe the whole thing had been a setup just to show us what they were capable of. We wrote up our reports, but nothing came of it. There were no leads, no suspects. The cabin was wiped clean of any fingerprints or useful evidence. The only thing left behind was that camera, still rolling, and the unsettling feeling that someone was out there, watching us the whole time. Weeks passed, but the feeling never left me. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had let us go that night was still out there, still watching. It was like a dark shadow hanging over me, always there, always waiting. The scariest part wasn't that we had been let go. It was knowing that it wasn't over. Not for me, not for my team. We hadn't been spared. We had been marked. Whoever they were, they weren't done yet. I could feel it. I could sense it every time I walked into the station, every time I went out on another call. They were waiting, and one day they were going to finish what they started. I hadn't seen my ex-wife in years, so when she called out of nowhere, it caught me by surprise. She sounded different, calm, almost like she missed the past. She said she wanted to meet up, to talk about everything that happened between us, and suggested we go somewhere private. She told me about a cabin she had rented, out in the middle of the woods, just the two of us, no one else around. It felt like a strange idea, but I was curious and still had some feelings left. So I agreed. When I got to the cabin, it looked peaceful and quiet. It was small and made of old wood, with trees all around that blocked most of the sky. I got out of the car, the cold air hitting me, and walked toward the cabin. It felt cut off from the world, far away from everything and everyone. Inside, it was simple but cozy, with a fire already burning in the stone fireplace. She must have been there for a while, setting things up. I put my bag down, feeling a bit uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. The night started off fine. We talked about old times, things that used to make us laugh. But as the evening went on, something felt off. It wasn't just the weirdness of being around her again after so long. It felt like something heavier, something unsaid hanging in the air. Time moved slow, and I noticed how the trees outside seemed to press closer to the cabin as the sun went down. Darkness came fast in the woods. The wind outside started to pick up, making a low, creepy sound as it moved through the trees. Inside, the fire was the only light. I tried to relax, but I couldn't. Something felt wrong. I didn't know if it was being with her again, after everything that happened, or if it was this cabin. It didn't feel right. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to figure out why I was so tense. I looked over at her, and she was sitting on the edge of her chair, staring at me. There was something in her face, something cold and distant, not like the person I used to know. She stood up and walked over to the window, staring out into the dark forest. The silence in the room stretched on too long. I felt my anxiety grow, but it stuck to me like I couldn't shake it off. I stood up, thinking about leaving, but something made me stop. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just wanted to know why she brought me here. She turned around slowly, and for a second, I saw it. The look, the same cold, empty look she had before we split up. Like she wasn't really there, like her mind was somewhere else, watching, waiting. I suddenly felt like I had made a huge mistake by coming here. The wind outside was getting louder, and the fire was almost out. I looked around, feeling the walls closing in. The shadows stretched longer, and the room felt smaller. My heart started to pound. I grabbed my bag and went for the door, but before I could get there, I felt her hand grab my arm. She didn't say anything, just stood there, gripping my wrist hard, too hard. I pulled free and ran to my car, leaving her standing by the door. I didn't look back. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew something wasn't right. I've thought about it over and over, but I still can't shake the feeling I had back there. That look she gave me, like she had planned all of this, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I don't know if she wanted to hurt me or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but one thing is clear. I'll never go back to that cabin. I can't, because as I was driving away, just before the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw her standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. And she wasn't alone. There was someone else, someone taller, standing right behind her in the dark, too far to make out clearly but close enough to see. It wasn't my imagination. I worked as a park ranger for a few years, mostly in a part of the forest far away from everything. We had an old cabin deep in the woods where we stayed during long shifts. It wasn't much, just one small room with a bed, a stove, and a little table. It always felt really alone out there. No phone signal, and the nearest road was miles away. But after a while, I got used to it. It became my place to stay when I had to patrol deep into the forest. One evening, after a long day at work, I made the hike up to the cabin. The sun was going down, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the path. As I got closer to the cabin, I noticed something was off. The front door was a bit open. I knew for sure I'd closed it the last time I was there. I thought maybe the wind had blown it open. I walked in and checked everything. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing was missing, and everything was where it should be. I closed the door and locked it behind me, trying not to overthink it. I sat down and made myself some coffee. After about an hour, it started getting dark. The woods outside got really quiet, that kind of silence where you feel like something might be nearby, watching. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the bed and lay down. I was so tired from the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like I wasn't really alone. I lay there, listening closely. I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise. The floorboards creaked, like someone was walking slowly across the room. I froze. My mind tried to tell me it was just the cabin settling. But the sound came again, louder, and this time it was closer. I sat up quickly, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it around the room. The light cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty. I checked the door, still locked. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it must have been an animal outside or just my tired mind playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound came from inside. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep wasn't coming anytime soon, though. A few hours went by before I finally passed out. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to come up, lighting the room with a faint glow. I felt a little embarrassed for being so scared last night. I stretched, packed up my stuff, and got ready to leave. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. They weren't mine. I had been wearing boots. These prints circled the cabin, slowly moving around it, like someone had been walking outside all night, watching. My stomach dropped. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the forest. I stood there for a long time, staring into the woods, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been out there, walking around while I was inside, listening to me, watching me, and they had been close enough that I could hear them moving. I never saw anyone, never figured out who or what left those prints. But I couldn't shake the thought of how close they'd been, how long they'd been out there circling the cabin. After that, I never stayed there again. But that's not the worst part. A few months later, a hiker went missing not far from that area. The search teams found his tent, his clothes, even his boots, but no sign of him. His bare footprints led off into the woods, and then, just like before, they disappeared. I went to the cabin with my wife and her mom for the weekend. I didn't really want to go, but it was something my wife thought we should do together. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main road. It felt cut off from everything the way cabins usually do, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was peaceful, just trees and the sound of wind every now and then. We had packed plenty of food, so we didn't need to leave for anything. The first night was pretty normal. The air was cool, and the woods were quiet except for the usual sounds. Branches swaying and maybe a stick breaking somewhere far off. I slept, but not well. The old cabin creaked all night, and it made me feel uneasy. The next day was nothing special either. We ate, took a walk in the woods, and sat on the porch. My mother-in-law didn't say much, but she kept looking at me. I could feel her watching me every time I moved. At first, I didn't think anything of it. We've never really been close, but this felt different. Her eyes stayed on me for too long, and the silence between us felt heavy. The second night, I started feeling weird about things. I kept hearing noises outside. At first, I thought it was an animal moving around in the trees. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it sounded like footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I just laid there, listening. Then the footsteps stopped, right by the window. I didn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Nothing happened after that, and eventually I fell back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and saw something strange. There were deep marks in the dirt by the side of the cabin, like something heavy had been dragged through it. I walked around the whole cabin and saw the same kind of marks all the way around. It was unsettling. I didn't tell my wife or her mom about it because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to think myself. That evening, things felt even worse. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, almost thick, and the forest outside was strangely quiet. Usually there'd be birds or something, but not that night. It was dead silent. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to go too far. That's when I saw her, my mother-in-law, standing just at the edge of the trees, looking straight at me. She hadn't said a word all day, but the way she stood there, just staring, made my skin crawl. It wasn't like she was just looking at me. It was like she was waiting for something. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I peeked out the window, and she was still standing there, not moving at all. I didn't know what to do. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but I couldn't stop the growing tension inside me. Hours went by, and she finally came inside. I tried to act normal, but the night was worse than before. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my wife's. It was coming from outside, near the bedroom window. I didn't look. I just stayed as still as I could, trapped in my bed, waiting for it to stop. When it finally did, I was too scared to fall back asleep. The next morning, I went outside again. The marks around the cabin were even deeper, like something had been dragging itself around the cabin all night. And once again, my mother-in-law was staring at me like she knew something I didn't. The air in the cabin felt suffocating, and I wanted to leave, but I didn't have a good reason. I knew it would sound crazy if I said anything. That night, I stayed awake. I sat by the window waiting to hear the sounds again. And just like before, they came, slow, heavy footsteps moving around the cabin. But this time, I heard something else too. Something being dragged through the dirt. It was slow, and it sounded wet, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. I froze, my heart racing. The sounds moved around the cabin, coming closer and closer until they stopped right outside the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I forced myself to peek through the curtain. There was nothing there, just the trees swaying a little in the wind. But the ground outside the window was all messed up, like something had been standing there, watching me. By morning, I was ready to leave. I didn't care if I didn't have a reason. I just wanted to go. I went to find my wife, but she wasn't in the cabin. Neither was her mother. The whole cabin was silent, and I started to panic. I looked everywhere, inside and out, but they were gone. There was no sign of them, except for those deep drag marks in the dirt, leading into the woods. I didn't follow them. Something inside me told me not to. I knew if I went into those woods, I wouldn't come back. The way her mother had stared at me, the way she waited, like she was planning something. And now they were both gone. I left the cabin that day alone, and I haven't seen my wife or her mother since. I never told anyone what happened. I'm not sure anyone would believe me anyway, but every now and then, I hear those slow, steady footsteps. I hear something being dragged through the dirt, heavy and wet, and every time I know it's getting closer. I had just settled into my cabin for the weekend, a small retreat in the woods. It was a cozy place, far from any noise, with nothing but the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the silence. The cabin was in a secluded spot, but there was another cabin about 100 yards away, barely visible through the trees. I hadn't seen anyone around since I got there, so I figured my neighbors must be away. That evening, I noticed something odd. The cabin next door had its lights on, even though no car was parked outside. The lights flickered on and off, which made me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a problem with their generator or a power issue. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the neighboring cabin. I jumped out of bed, straining to hear over the creaks of the old wooden floors. The sound was followed by what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I thought it was probably just an animal, but the noise was too steady, too rhythmic. I decided to check it out, grabbing a flashlight and a heavy stick for protection. Stepping outside, I moved cautiously toward the neighboring cabin. The night air was cool, and every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. As I got closer, I saw the flickering lights were now steady. The windows, usually dark, were glowing warmly. I sneaked up to the cabin, shining my flashlight through a crack in the curtains. What I saw made my heart race. The inside of the cabin was a mess. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, and personal items scattered everywhere. It looked like there had been a violent struggle. Suddenly, I heard a soft shuffling sound behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My flashlight beam moved over the surrounding trees, but I saw only shadows. I went back to the cabin and noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with the stick, trying not to make any noise. Inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. I scanned the room with my flashlight. The scene was even worse than I'd thought. It was clear someone had been living there recently, and not in a normal way. Old food containers were scattered around, and there was a strong smell of mildew mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. I heard a noise from the back room and froze. It sounded like something, or someone, shuffling around. I took a deep breath and slowly approached the source of the noise. Peeking around the corner, I saw an old man huddled in a corner, looking disheveled and frightened. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. It was clear he had been hiding here, and from the state of the cabin, he had been living in fear. I realized he was likely the cause of the disturbance and had been squatting in the cabin, probably running from something or someone else. I slowly backed away, not wanting to provoke him. Once outside, I called the police. They arrived quickly, and after they investigated, they confirmed the man was wanted for questioning related to several thefts in the area. They took him away, and I was left with the unsettling realization of how close I had come to danger. The police made sure the cabin was secured, and I spent the rest of my weekend on edge. The flickering lights had been a desperate attempt to signal for help, but it was too late. As I packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, something that was never quite visible, but always there. The quiet woods now felt menacing, and I knew that sometimes the most peaceful places can hide the most disturbing secrets. I left with a shiver, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't looked next door. My grandmother's cabin in the Russian countryside was always a comforting place. Hidden deep in the forest, it was a peaceful retreat away from the city's noise. When she fell ill and needed help, I offered to stay with her and take care of the place. The first few days went smoothly. I chopped wood, cooked meals, and kept an eye on her. The forest outside was calm, but there was an unusual quietness that felt heavy in the cabin. I thought it was just the isolation and the cold winter making everything feel still. One night, while I was sitting by the fire, a loud bang came from the attic, which I had avoided due to its dark, creepy vibe. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But the banging continued, thumps and dragging sounds that got louder as the night went on. I decided to check it out. With a flashlight and a crowbar, I climbed the old squeaky stairs to the attic. The air was chilly and musty. When I reached the top, the noise stopped suddenly. I shone the flashlight around and saw old, dusty furniture and forgotten items. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to go back down, I spotted a small door in the corner that I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly open, showing a narrow space beyond. I was hesitant but felt a strong urge to see what was inside. I pushed the door open and found a small hidden room with a wooden chest covered in cobwebs. My heart raced as I opened the chest. Inside were old handwritten letters and photos of people I didn't know. They seemed very old, and one photo stood out. It was of a young woman who looked strikingly like my grandmother, but much younger. As I read the letters, I learned they were written by someone who had lived in the cabin long before my grandmother. The letters talked about strange things happening and a constant feeling of being watched. The last letter was particularly disturbing. It mentioned a hidden space in the attic where someone had disappeared years ago. The writer was convinced that something evil had taken them. The realization hit me hard. The noises and the feeling of being watched were not just my imagination. There was something about this cabin, tied to its past, that caused these strange events. The next morning, I packed my things and decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had dark secrets best left alone. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, the trees like silent witnesses to the cabin's eerie history. When I told my grandmother what I found, she was quiet. It was clear that the cabin had been hiding its secrets from her too. She thanked me for looking after her and for revealing the truth, though she didn't seem surprised. Now, whenever I think of that cabin, I feel a shiver. The forest feels like it's waiting for the next person to uncover its dark secrets. The cabin stands as a chilling reminder that some places are better left alone, their mysteries buried under layers of dust and fear. Every time I remember that attic and those letters, a cold chill runs down my spine, and I wonder if the cabin is still watching, waiting for the next curious soul to discover what lies hidden in its depths. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to spend a weekend by myself in that old cabin, deep in the woods. I was looking for some quiet time to get away from the usual noise of life. I found the place mentioned on an old camping website. People said it was far away, hardly ever used, and perfect if you wanted to get away from everything. It seemed like exactly what I needed. The drive there took longer than I thought it would. The roads got worse the further I went, turning into a narrow dirt track winding through thick trees. By the time I finally arrived, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Old, faded wood, a roof that was starting to sag, and a door that seemed like it was barely hanging on. It was all by itself, just like they said. No one else around. The first night was calm. I started a small fire in the wood stove and tried to relax. The sounds of the forest outside helped me settle down a bit. But when night fully set in, the darkness around the cabin felt heavy. I wasn't used to it being this dark. So dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Every little noise outside stood out. I could hear every rustle, every crack of a branch. At first, I told myself it was just animals, but some of the sounds felt different, too close and too steady to be deer or something. The next day, I decided to walk around a bit and check out the area. I spent some time walking through the woods, enjoying how quiet it was. But as I walked, I started getting this weird feeling, like I wasn't alone. I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye more than once, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the trees and shadows. By the time I got back to the cabin, I felt uneasy. That night, the noises came back, but louder this time. I could hear footsteps, slow and steady, crunching through the dry leaves and twigs. They were moving around the cabin. I tried to stay calm, thinking it had to be an animal, maybe a bear, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. The steps were too slow, too careful, like someone was walking in circles around the cabin, taking their time. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Around the cabin, in the dirt, were clear footprints. Human footprints. Someone had been out there, walking around while I was inside. The prints were fresh, leading off into the woods. I had no idea who it could have been or why they were there. Suddenly, the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Felt like I was being hunted. I didn't waste time. I packed my stuff as fast as I could, deciding to leave right away instead of waiting until the weekend was over. As I was loading my things into the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Deep scratches, long and jagged, carved into the wooden door. They hadn't been there the day before. It looked like someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the door while I was inside. My heart pounded. Those weren't animal scratches. Someone had been there, scratching at the door while I was asleep. I didn't stick around to figure out who it was. I got in my car and drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road hours later. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there, but I can't shake the feeling that they had been watching me the whole time, waiting. I keep thinking, if I hadn't left when I did, I might have woken up to those scratches being made from the inside. I work as a ranger in one of the more remote forests in the state. It's the kind of place where people don't really visit except for a few campers or hunters who like the risk. Most days, I'm out there by myself, walking the trails, clearing fallen branches, and making sure everything stays safe. There's an old cabin deep in the forest that we use as a base when we have to stay longer, far from the main station. It's out there on its own, with no phone service and miles away from the closest road. The forest has a name for being dangerous. Locals say it's not a good place to be alone at night. People talk about folks disappearing, hikers who never come back, hunters who vanish without a trace. I always figured it was just the wilderness. People get lost all the time and accidents happen. I had to head out to that cabin for a few days to check on some reports of illegal hunting. The hike out was nothing special, just thick trees and quiet. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was going down. When I opened the door, it smelled stale, like no one had been in there for a while. Felt normal though. I had stayed there before and it was just a simple shelter. The only thing that felt a bit off was how quiet it was. But the forest was always like that at night, so I didn't think much of it. The first night went fine. I woke up to birds singing in the morning, grabbed my gear, and went out to check the area. Everything seemed normal, just another day on the job. But as the sun started to set and I headed back to the cabin, something felt wrong. The forest felt heavier, like something was watching me. I could feel it in my stomach, that uneasy feeling that you're not alone. The second night is when things got strange. I was lying on the old cot, half asleep, when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too heavy for that, like someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed still, listening, hoping it was just a deer or something. But the footsteps circled the cabin slowly, as if they were checking it out. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got up from the cot. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, not moving, waiting. Then, I heard a soft knock on the door. It wasn't loud or rushed, just a slow, soft knock. My heart started racing, and I felt a cold chill run through my whole body. I didn't open the door. I didn't even move. I just stood there, listening. Whoever was out there didn't knock again. They didn't leave either. I could feel them, standing on the other side of the door, just waiting. It felt like hours before I finally heard the footsteps again. This time, they walked away, slowly disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there on the edge of the cot, staring at the door, waiting for them to come back. By the time the sun came up, I was completely drained. I decided I had enough and packed my stuff to leave. But something kept bugging me. When I went outside, there were no tracks, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been near the cabin. The ground looked untouched. It was like whatever or whoever was out there had never been there at all. As I hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. Still, I knew something was following me. The forest didn't feel right. Felt like I wasn't welcome. When I finally got back to the station, I decided I wasn't going back to that cabin. I didn't report what happened. I knew no one would believe me, and there wasn't really much to say. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Sometimes the forest just isn't on your side. It's old, it's wild, and it doesn't care about you or your rules. Some places out there aren't meant for us. And sometimes you get the feeling that something else is out there, watching you, waiting. Maybe it's best not to find out what it is. It was a last-minute decision to go to the cabin. Work had been crazy, and I needed to get away from everything. The cabin was deep in the woods in northern Maine, far away from everything. No power, no cell signal, and the closest town was miles away. That's why I liked it. No people, just quiet. I got there just before it got dark, unpacked my stuff, and got ready for the night. The air was cool, and the only noise was the wind in the trees and the occasional sound of some animal far away. I made a fire in the little wood stove to warm up the cabin and sat down to relax. By the time it was fully dark, the cabin was completely black except for the flicker of the fire. I sat there for a while, just staring at the flames, enjoying the silence around me. It was so quiet, I could almost feel it. Something about being this cut off from everything made me feel uneasy, but that's why I came here, to be alone. After a while, I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. At first, I thought it was nothing, probably a deer or some other animal. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. I got up, walked to the window, and looked out. All I saw was darkness. The fire didn't light up much outside, and I couldn't see past the porch. I stood there for a minute, listening, but it was quiet again. I figured it was just my nerves and went back to sit by the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Felt like someone was watching me. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the front door. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me right away. I shone the light around, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I stood there for a few seconds, looking around, before heading back inside. I locked the door behind me, even though I knew it was probably just in my head. Still, something about the whole thing made me uneasy. I laid down in the small bed, the fire still making soft crackling sounds. I was tired, but I couldn't stop thinking about the noise. It just didn't sit right with me. I listened, hoping to hear something that would make sense of it, but all I heard was silence. Sometime later, I must have fallen asleep, but I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second, I didn't know why, but then I heard it again, a noise outside. This time, it wasn't just an animal. It was slow, careful footsteps, like someone walking around the cabin. I froze, listening. The footsteps were steady, moving around the outside. Whoever it was stopped right outside the front door. My heart raced and I didn't move. I just sat there, hoping they'd go away. Then the door handle started to move. I sat up quickly, trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing. Should I grab something? Should I yell to scare them off? But the door handle rattled again, harder this time. My chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I sat in the dark, frozen with fear, hoping the door would stay locked. And just like that, it stopped. The handle went still, and there was silence again. I didn't dare move. I listened, straining to hear if they were still outside. But there was nothing, just the sound of the fire burning low. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, too scared to close my eyes. Every creak, every little noise made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little braver. I got up and checked the door. It was still locked. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside, my flashlight in hand. The ground was covered in leaves, and I saw clear footprints circling the cabin, just like I had heard. But what made my stomach drop were the scratches on the door. Deep scratches, right by the door handle, like someone had been trying to get in. I didn't wait around to see if they'd come back. I grabbed my stuff, threw it in the car, and left as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, feeling like something was following me. I never looked back at the cabin. That was the last time I went there. I don't know who or what was outside that night, and I don't want to know. The cabin is still out there, sitting empty in the woods. Sometimes I wonder if someone else will find it and stay the night. Maybe they'll hear those same footsteps, or worse. Maybe they'll open the door. I'll never find out, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still waiting. I agreed to spend a weekend with my mother-in-law at a cabin in the woods. My wife couldn't go, but she thought it would help us get closer. I wasn't excited about it, but I figured I could handle a few days. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town or phone signal. It was old but solid, made of thick logs with small windows. The trees around it were tall, swaying in the wind. My mother-in-law loved the place, but to me, it felt lonely, like it was closing in on me. The first day wasn't anything special. We unpacked, walked around the trails nearby, and I tried to settle in. That night, something felt different. The air was cold, and the wind was loud, howling through the trees. The cabin creaked a lot, making it hard to sleep. Eventually, I fell asleep, though. I woke up in the middle of the night. The wind had stopped, but there was another noise now. It was quiet, but steady, like footsteps crunching on leaves. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but the sound kept getting louder, and I realized something was out there. The next day, I told my mother-in-law about it, but she didn't seem to care, so I ignored it too. We spent the day like before, walking and trying to relax. That night, the noise came back again, only this time it was closer, right outside the cabin. It didn't sound heavy, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But the sound moved around the cabin, circling it slowly. I heard it on the porch, moving carefully. I didn't want to get up and check, so I stayed under the covers, hoping it would stop. In the morning, I went outside to look around. Everything seemed normal. No tracks, no signs that anything had been there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It made my skin crawl. That last night, I hardly slept. I kept hearing small noises, taps, scratches, like something was trying to get inside. Around 3 in the morning, the footsteps came back. But this time, they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the front door. I could hear someone breathing, soft but clear. I was frozen in bed, waiting for whatever it was to leave, but it didn't. The door handle started to shake slowly at first, then harder. It wasn't random. Someone was trying to get in. My heart raced, hoping the door would stay locked. After a few moments, the rattling stopped, but the footsteps didn't go away. They moved toward the window, the one right next to my bed. I could hear it outside, but I didn't dare look. When morning came, I told my mother-in-law we were leaving early. I didn't care what she thought. I just wanted out. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew someone or something had been there watching us. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told my wife what really happened. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear that same sound outside. The soft crunch of footsteps, getting closer. And every time, I wonder if it followed me home. I had just started my shift at the security cabin for a remote campground. The sun was setting, filling the sky with orange and purple. I checked the monitors to make sure everything was okay. The campground was quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. As night fell, the trees looked bigger, their branches stretching out like fingers into the darkening sky. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling a chill that went beyond the cool air. The cabin was small and plain, with just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a radio that buzzed with static. Around midnight, I noticed something odd on the monitor. One of the campsites was flickering, first dark, then a sudden flash of light. I frowned, unsure whether to check it out. Part of me said to stay inside, but curiosity tugged at me, pulling me toward the door. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air felt thick, and the rustling leaves seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. I walked down the path to the campsite, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark. As I got closer, I saw what was causing the flickering. A lantern swinging back and forth, but there was no one around. My heart raced. I looked around, but the place was empty. A faint smell of smoke hung in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Just as I turned to go back, I heard a crack behind me. I froze, my blood running cold. It sounded like footsteps crunching on twigs. I flashed my light around, but it barely cut through the darkness beyond the trees. The hairs on my neck stood up. I hurried back toward the cabin, my heart pounding louder with each step. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and sat at my desk, trying to shake off the fear. I focused on the monitors, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that campsite. Why would someone leave a lantern swinging like that? Suddenly, the radio crackled, shattering the silence. I jumped, nearly spilling my coffee. It was just static, but then I thought I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper. My heart raced again. I turned the volume up, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the static. Then, a loud bang echoed outside, making me jump out of my chair. I peered out the window, but saw nothing. The night was too still, and the darkness felt thick. I kept glancing at the monitors, praying for morning. Hours passed, and finally, The first light of dawn broke through the trees. The campground looked normal, but my nerves were frayed. I decided I had to check the campsite. As I walked over, I felt the weight of what happened last night pressing on me. I found the lantern still swinging, but now it was off. The ground around it was disturbed, like someone had been there recently. I knelt down, searching for footprints, but all I found was a small piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it belonged to a jacket. A sense of dread washed over me. Someone had been here and they might still be close. I quickly returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I called the local authorities, my voice trembling as I described what happened. They arrived shortly after, and when I pointed them toward the campsite, they found signs of a struggle. A few hours later, they confirmed that a camper had been reported missing the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been near something terrible. I had never felt so vulnerable. From that day on, I kept my eyes peeled, knowing the quiet of the woods could hide dark secrets. Weeks passed, and though I tried to forget, the unease settled deep in my bones. Each shift, the shadows seemed darker, the noises sharper. I'd hear twigs snap or the rustle of leaves and my heart would race. Felt like I was being watched. One night, as I was about to close up, I heard a soft tapping on the window. I turned slowly, and there was nothing there, but I could feel the chill in the air, as if something had passed too close. The radio crackled again, but this time it was clear. "Help me?" the voice whispered, chilling me to the core. It was faint but unmistakable. I jumped to my feet, grabbing my flashlight, and ran outside. The campground was empty, but the air was heavy with an unseen presence. As I scanned the area, I felt the urge to run, to escape, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was the fear of what might be lurking just out of sight, watching me. I turned to head back inside when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I swung the flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing, only darkness. I locked the cabin door and sat down, my heart racing. The voice lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. From that moment on, I knew the woods held secrets far worse than I could imagine. The sense of safety I once felt was gone, replaced by a chilling awareness that something was out there, waiting, watching, and it might come for me next. I was on a business trip at a remote cabin, far away from the city noise. My boss wanted to get away from the usual distractions, so I ended up alone in this quiet place surrounded by thick woods. The cabin was simple, just a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a loft with a bed. On the first night, I spent hours going over reports, but the stillness outside made me uneasy. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, nothing to worry about. As the sun set, darkness covered the cabin, and the only light came from the flickering fire. I tried to focus on my work, but a knot formed in my stomach. The second night felt different. I heard strange sounds outside, scratching and shuffling. At first, I thought it was just animals again, but it felt different, almost like someone was doing it on purpose. I pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. I locked the door, reminding myself I was safe inside. As I lay in bed, I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart raced again. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. I tried to fall asleep, but the noise continued, soft but steady. It felt like someone was pacing back and forth, their presence hanging in the air like a shadow. A cold feeling crept up my spine. The next morning, I decided to explore the area to shake off the feeling of anxiety. I walked through the woods, but my mind was filled with thoughts of the night before. When I got back to the cabin, something felt off. The front door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it, A wave of panic hit me as I pushed the door open. Inside, everything looked untouched, but I felt a chill. I quickly checked the windows. They were all shut tight. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I still had one more night there. I decided to stay alert. I set up my laptop in the living room and worked late, keeping the fire burning bright. As night fell, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, circling the cabin. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but the signal was weak. My heart pounded as I struggled with what to do. I felt exposed and scared. Then, I remembered the old emergency flare gun my boss insisted I take just in case. I found it in a drawer and took it outside. With shaky hands, I fired it into the air. The bright light lit up the trees, and for a moment, everything felt still. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I waited, the adrenaline rushing through me. Minutes felt like hours until I finally decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things, pushing myself to move quickly. I locked the cabin and stepped outside. The woods were unnervingly quiet, almost like they were holding their breath. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood alone, dark and still. I knew I wouldn't be coming back. Whatever had been lurking around that night was still out there, and it left a cold fear in my gut. The trip was supposed to be about work, but it taught me something deeper. Some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and not every sound in the dark is just the wind. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could still hear those footsteps in my mind, echoing in the silence, a reminder that the woods were alive with something far worse than I could imagine. I got to the cabin late in the afternoon, excited for a weekend away from the noise of the city. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I unpacked my things and settled in, feeling the heavy quiet wrap around me like a thick blanket. As night came, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace, the crackling warmth filling the small room. The cabin creaked with the wind outside, but the sounds felt comforting. After a simple dinner, I curled up with a book, the flickering flames throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard a noise. At first, it was soft, a rustle outside, just beyond the window. I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then it came again, louder this time, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart began to race. I stood up and peered through the window, but the darkness showed only the outlines of the trees. Trying to shake it off, I went back to my book. Just as I got comfortable again, a sharp knock on the door made me freeze. My heart dropped, and the hair on my neck stood up. No one should be out here. I slowly moved toward the door, my mind racing. Maybe it was someone lost or needing help. But deep down, unease gnawed at me. I stood still, listening. The knock came again, louder and more demanding. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and hid, peeking through the window. Moonlight revealed a figure standing just outside. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, staring in my direction. My instincts screamed at me to hide. I watched him pace back and forth, muttering to himself, his hands twitching. Was he dangerous? I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. I considered my choices. I could make a run for my car, but the man was right by the door. I couldn't just sit here waiting to see what he would do. Then I remembered the back door that led to the woods. I could slip out and find help. Taking a deep breath, I quietly moved to the back. As I turned the knob, I heard the front door splinter as he forced it open. Panic surged through me. I slipped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. The woods were dark, the trees looming like guards. I darted away from the cabin, plunging deeper into the forest. I kept my footsteps light, praying the man wouldn't hear me. The night buzzed with sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, but I focused on putting as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto an old dirt road. I knew it would lead me to the highway. I followed it, my heart racing, every sound making my fear grow. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I spotted the faint glow of headlights in the distance. I waved down a passing car, feeling both desperate and relieved. The driver was kind enough to take me back to town. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, now fading into the dark trees. A chill ran through me, the unsettling feeling still gripping my chest. I never went back to that cabin. The woods felt too full of secrets, and some places are best left alone. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that man pacing outside, whispering to himself. It made me wonder if he was still out there, watching. The thought lingered in my mind like a shadow. What if he was waiting for someone else to come to the cabin? What if he knew I had left? That feeling of being watched never fully faded, a reminder that solitude could draw in the wrong kind of company. The woods felt alive with danger, and sometimes the darkest corners of nature hide the most unsettling truths.